Lucas Bennett had finally found his peace. After 20 years of high-stakes courtroom battles in downtown Chicago, he'd retired early and moved to his family's old homestead in Maple Hollow, a quiet, tree-lined suburb known more for its manicured lawns than its sense of community. The only thing Lucas wanted now was to grow tomatoes, breathe fresh air, and find solace in the dirt after years of drowning in paper and litigation. Each morning, he knelt beside his gravel driveway in faded jeans and a gardening apron, his fingers caked with soil as he planted heirloom vegetables. It was therapy. It was home. But his tranquility shattered the moment Patricia Lang stepped onto his property. With her designer sunglasses, stiff posture, and ever-present clipboard, Patricia wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-appointed queen of the Brookstone HOA, a tyrant ruling through passive-aggressive emails and $75 aesthetic violation fines. "This vegetable patch," she said with a sniff, "isn't in compliance with our community's landscaping standards." Lucas looked up slowly, sun on his back, dirt under his nails, and a storm rising in his chest. She had no idea who she was dealing with, and she definitely didn't know he literally owned the land under her feet. Lucas Bennett didn't flinch when the bright orange violation notice that showed up on his front door the next morning. He just sighed, peeled it off, and added it to the growing stack of HOA nonsense sitting on his kitchen counter. Unapproved agricultural activity, as if growing a few tomatoes was an act of rebellion. He tried to ignore it. Really, he did. But 2 days later, things escalated fast. As Lucas stepped outside with his morning coffee, his stomach dropped. 3 bulldozers were parked across his driveway, blocking his car. Engines rumbled. Exhaust rose like smoke from a battlefield, and at the center of it all stood Patricia Lang, arms crossed, flanked by a smug-looking man in a gray suit. "Lucas," Patricia called out, voice syrupy sweet, but loud enough for every neighbor to hear. "The HOA board convened an emergency vote last night. You've left us no choice." The man stepped forward. "Robert Trent, legal counsel for Brookstone HOA." He adjusted his tie. "We're here to enforce Section 7.2b, immediate remediation of public nuisances. Your unauthorized structures, those garden beds, are to be removed." Lucas blinked. "You brought bulldozers to tear up my garden?" Patricia's eyes gleamed. Let this be a lesson in compliance. Neighbors began to gather on sidewalks. Phones came out. Whispering rippled through the street. Lucas stepped off his porch, heart thudding. "You have no legal grounds for this. My deed predates your HOA by 3 decades. Robert smirked. "The covenant applies to all current properties." Lucas pulled out his phone, thumbed a few times, and looked up. "You're sure about that?" He hit call. 2 blocks away, Sheriff Dana Morales was sipping her first cup of coffee when the call came through. Minutes later, her cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. "You're blocking his driveway with heavy equipment," she asked, voice sharp. "You have a court order?" Robert hesitated. "We don't need one. HOA authority gives us..." Sheriff Morales cut him off. "Without a court order, you're trespassing and threatening property destruction. That's criminal." Patricia sputtered. "This is a private HOA matter." But she didn't notice the black SUV pulling up behind the cruiser. Lucas did. The driver stepped out. Marjorie Grant, county clerk, clutching a thick folder of property records and maps. She walked straight to the sheriff, flipping through documents with a calm fury. Brookstone HOA was formed in 1996, she said. But Lucas Bennett's property, it's part of the Bennett Trust, registered in 1972. His land isn't just exempt from your covenant. He owns the easement your main road runs through, including where your bulldozers are parked. Patricia's mouth opened. No words came out. Robert paled. That's not possible. Lucas stepped forward slowly, voice low and calm. So here's the deal. You move those bulldozers now, or the next thing coming down that road is a lawsuit the size of your HOA's bloated renovation budget. The crowd gasped. The tide had turned. This wasn't about tomatoes anymore. It was war. Just when Lucas thought the bulldozers would back off, Patricia pulled out her trump card. This isn't over, she hissed under her breath, turning to Robert, who whispered something back with a nod. Less than an hour later, Lucas received a cease and desist letter. This time not from the HOA, but from Brookstone Development Partners, a shadowy LLC he'd never heard of. The letter claimed that the land Lucas was living on was actually improperly recorded in county records, and that a decades-old filing error meant he might not own the land at all. Lucas felt the blood drain from his face. He rushed back into the house and pulled out the deed, survey maps, the trust documents, everything. All legal, all filed properly. So what was this? He called Marjorie Grant at the county clerk's office. Her voice was Lucas, I just got a call from someone high up at the Planning Commission. They're trying to get your property reassessed under a revised zoning map from 2005. It's bogus, but if they succeed, they can challenge your trust's authority. They're going for eminent domain loopholes. Lucas stared at the phone in disbelief. Are you saying they're trying to steal my land? On paper? That's exactly what I'm saying. He hung up and stared at the small tomato plants swaying in the breeze outside. They were escalating. Fast. Within days, Lucas started seeing signs. County inspectors showed up claiming his irrigation system violated local codes. A fire marshal appeared about a complaint regarding hazardous materials in his garden shed. A citation came for a non-conforming mailbox. Patricia had weaponized the bureaucracy, but what they didn't know was that Lucas had once specialized in property and land use litigation. And now, they'd pulled him back into the courtroom. But this time, it was personal. He called in favors. He called in friends. He called in the press. The first article hit local news within 48 hours. Retired lawyer claims HOA attempted land theft over vegetable garden. The second article dug deeper. HOA president linked to development firm behind 2-member rezoning effort. That one made waves. Patricia's polished veneer began to crack. Neighbors who once feared her began asking questions. Why were their fees going up every year? Why was the pool still broken after the renovation fund collected over $150,000? Why had only 2 families, both friends of Patricia, ever won Lawn of the Month? Then, one night, Eleanor Chavez, the oldest resident in the neighborhood, showed up at Lucas's door with a shoebox full of papers. I've been paying dues here for two years, she said. But something never sat right. Inside the box were decades of HOA financial records, including handwritten notes from previous treasurers. Some with suspicious redactions, others with account numbers that didn't match. Lucas flipped through the papers, his lawyer's instincts buzzing. This wasn't just power abuse. This was fraud, and he had the proof to burn it all down. Lucas Bennett never wanted to be a leader. He just wanted peace. Some dirt under his nails, and a quiet place to grow tomatoes. But as he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by old HOA financial statements, fraudulent filings, and copies of forged complaints from the past 5 years, a quiet fury built inside him. This wasn't just about his garden anymore. This was about everyone Patricia had silenced. He picked up Eleanor's handwritten notes again. Pages detailing late-night meetings, secret votes, fake ballots, even a scanned letter from 2017 where Patricia threatened to raise fines on a disabled veteran unless he removed that offensive wheelchair ramp. Lucas had read enough. He looked out his window at the neatly aligned houses of Brookstone, once identical, now subtly stained by fear. He saw Mr. Chu, the retired teacher who'd been fined $300 for planting wildflowers, the Lopez family, who hadn't been allowed to repaint their front door because deep blue wasn't harmonious, even young Kayla, who cried last Christmas when the HOA forced her parents to take down the lights she'd helped hang. They were all victims of Patricia's rule by fear, and Lucas realized he was the one who could end it. The next morning, he held a meeting, not at City Hall, but right in his driveway next to the now famous garden beds. He passed out flyers titled "Know Your Rights" and shared what he'd discovered. More than 30 neighbors showed up. By the time the sun went down, Lucas wasn't just a retired lawyer anymore. He was the voice of a neighborhood that had had enough. "I can fight this," he told the crowd, holding up the deed to his land. "But I shouldn't have to fight it alone, because this isn't just about me. This is about every single one of us who paid into a system that turned against us. A system run by a woman who forgot what community means." He laid the folder on a folding table, open for everyone to see. The evidence of Patricia's corruption. Gasps rippled as neighbors read where their money had gone. Lavish consulting fees, private security detail for Patricia's home during Halloween, even a $12,000 landscaping contract for native trees that only appeared in her own backyard. By the end of the night, the neighborhood was no longer afraid. Lucas hadn't just sparked outrage, he'd sparked hope. And Patricia? She was nowhere to be seen, but Lucas knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't go down quietly, not when he was finally forcing the truth into the sunlight, and not when the community she'd once ruled was now marching straight toward her, with Lucas leading the way. A week ago, Lucas Bennett had been just another quiet neighbor who liked tomatoes. Now, he was spearheading a revolution in suburbia. After the explosive driveway meeting, word spread fast Patricia Lang tried to control the damage, but the damage was already in motion. Local news picked up the story, complete with video footage of bulldozers, angry neighbors, and Lucas standing tall with paperwork in one hand and a trowel in the other. The headline was brutal. HOA tyrant caught in land grab as retired lawyer uncovers fraud. But the real victory came 2 days later. Lucas was sitting on his porch when Eleanor showed up again. This time, she brought 4 more original homeowners. Is all part of the historic exemption clause Patricia had been suppressing for years. "We've been quiet too long," one of them said. "But you gave us a voice again." Together, they formed a committee, the Brookstone Reform Coalition. Lucas didn't want power, but he had knowledge. Legal knowledge. And now, the trust of people who were tired of hiding their frustrations behind polite smiles and HOA fear. Their goal? dissolve the current board, audit every account, and write a new community charter from the ground up. But first, they needed proof. That's when Eleanor pulled out a surprise. "I kept one more folder," she said with a sly grin. "I didn't want to scare you too early." Inside were scanned email exchanges between Patricia and Robert Trent, the HOA's lawyer, discussing how to strategically fine and pressure certain homeowners until they either sold out or shut up. They even referenced target lists of elderly, disabled, or low-income residents they considered high risk for property value disruption. Lucas felt his blood go cold. This wasn't just corruption, this was systemic bullying. He sent the evidence to a journalist he'd worked with years ago. Within 24 hours, it made national headlines, and within 48 hours, the State Housing Commission contacted him directly. "Mr. Bennett," the woman on the phone said, "we'd like to discuss a pilot program about homeowner rights and HOA accountability. Would you consider advising?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, stunned. He looked out across the neighborhood. There was Mr. Chu, planting wildflowers again. The Lopez family had repainted their door, electric blue this time, and neighbors complimented it as they walked by. Kayla's Christmas lights were already going up in August, strung between trees like soft sparks of defiance. For the first time in years, people were smiling. This wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a movement. And Lucas, he'd gone from planting tomatoes to planting the seeds of something bigger. Something honest. Something neighborly. Something that made people feel like they actually belonged on the land they called home. And this was only the beginning. Lucas Bennett had spent most of his adult life arguing in courtrooms on behalf of billion-dollar clients, but nothing had prepared him for how emotional it felt to fight for his neighbors. Every morning now, instead of reviewing contracts or zoning laws, he reviewed handwritten letters from residents who had finally found the courage to speak up. "Thank you," one note read. "I thought I was the only one afraid of the HOA, but now for the first time in 10 years, I feel safe in my own home." Another neighbor, a widower named Mr. Reed, approached Lucas during a morning walk. "My wife planted those daffodils before she passed. Patricia fined me $200 for keeping them. I almost dug them up, but now I won't." Lucas's garden had once been just a personal retreat. Now, it was a gathering place. Neighbors brought lawn chairs and lemonade. Kids played beside the raised beds, while Lucas taught them how to plant carrots and basil. Retirees who had once kept their curtains shut now spent afternoons in open-air discussions about community, respect, and fairness. The man who used to keep to himself was now at the center of something that mattered. But it wasn't just Lucas who had changed. The community had changed with him. The Brookstone Reform Coalition had grown from 5 residents to over 70. They had filed for an emergency injunction to freeze the current HOA's authority. And won. The judge, reading over Patricia's paper trail, had called the HOA's leadership deeply concerning and potentially criminal. Patricia, once the queen bee of Brookstone, now wouldn't step outside her home without hiding behind her sunglasses and a tight scarf. Her lawyer, Robert Trent, had gone silent after a formal complaint was filed with the Bar Association. Lucas, meanwhile, spent his evenings at folding tables in the community clubhouse, writing a new charter with his neighbors, one that included transparency, term limits, and most importantly, empathy. He'd stopped asking himself if he was doing the right thing. He knew he was, and yet, even with the progress, Lucas never let the fire in his chest die down. He kept a photo of his original violation notice taped above his desk, not out of spite, but as a reminder of where this all started. One tomato plant, one act of quiet rebellion. He smiled as he watered the garden that night, the soft hum of conversation drifting from porch to porch. This was no longer a war. It was a transformation. The neighborhood was finally becoming what it should have been all along, a place where people weren't afraid to be themselves. Lucas didn't set out to lead a movement, but when the moment came, he didn't back down. And somewhere along the way, the quiet man with a garden became the reason an entire community remembered how to stand up. And how to stand together. The day Patricia Lang moved out of Brookstone, no one lined the streets. There were no tearful goodbyes, no farewell cupcakes, just the distant hum of a moving truck and the silent, satisfied glances exchanged between neighbors as they walked their dogs or watered their gardens. Lucas Bennett stood quietly on his porch, watching her SUV pull away for the last time. He wasn't smiling, not because he hadn't won, but because it wasn't about beating her anymore. It was about what they'd built in her place. 3 months earlier, Brookstone had been a neighborhood on edge, controlled by fear, passive aggressiveness, and HOA notices disguised as reminders. Now, the air felt lighter, brighter, fuller. The new charter passed by a landslide. It included clauses for transparency, financial oversight, and resident-led initiatives. Fines were no longer the first response. They were the last. Violations came with friendly conversations, not threats. And a new committee had been formed to support elderly and disabled neighbors with yard work and home repairs. Lucas watched as Kayla, the girl who once cried when her Christmas lights were torn down, painted a colorful mural on the new community shed with her parents. Her laugh echoed down the street. The once feared HOA office had been converted into a community cafe and tool library, stocked with donated hammers, hedge trimmers, and coffee beans from a local roaster. Even Patricia's former allies, neighbors who once kept quiet or looked the other way, had come around. Some apologized. Others brought over baked goods. A few joined Lucas at his weekly Sunday afternoon garden class, where they laughed about how terrifying cilantro can be if planted too close to mint. The local paper dubbed it the Garden Rebellion. How one man turned HOA tyranny into neighborhood unity. But Lucas knew it wasn't just him. It was Eleanor, who had quietly documented injustice for years. It was Mr. Chu, who stood his ground with his wildflowers. It was the parents, the veterans, the introverts, and the optimists. People who had been told to stay small, and finally realized they never had to. That evening, they held their first Brookston sunset picnic, an idea Lucas had jokingly pitched weeks earlier. Blankets spread across the common lawn. Children chased fireflies. Someone played acoustic guitar, while others passed around lemonade and slices of homemade pie. People were laughing again. Together, Lucas stood to say a few words, unsure of what he'd say, until he opened his mouth. "I didn't plan this," he began, "and I sure as hell didn't expect to be leading a rebellion over a vegetable garden. But I'm glad we did it, because somewhere along the way, we stopped asking, who makes the rules, and started asking, what kind of neighbors do we want to be? Applause filled the air, and in that moment, as the sun dipped below the rooftops of a community no longer ruled by fear, Lucas Bennett finally felt at home. Sometimes, the most powerful revolutions start with the quietest rebellions. Lucas Bennett never intended to fight an HOA. All he wanted was a peaceful life and a few homegrown tomatoes. But when injustice crept into his front yard, disguised as rules and regulations, he stood up, not just for himself, but for everyone too afraid to speak. The truth is, real power doesn't come from titles or bylaws. It comes from integrity, from community, and from the courage to say, enough. One man with the right knowledge and a good heart can uproot decades of fear, but it takes a village to grow something better. In a world that often rewards silence, Lucas proved that doing the right thing might not be easy, but it's always worth it. And sometimes, the most unlikely leaders are the ones who've spent the most time on their knees, in the dirt, planting hope. If you live in a neighborhood with a restrictive HOA, you're not powerless. Read your bylaws. Know your property rights. Research your land deeds. Ask questions, especially about where your dues go. Most importantly, talk to your neighbors. You might be surprised how many of them feel the same. One voice can be dismissed, but many voices, united, cannot. And if things feel unfair or unjust, don't settle. Use your resources. Local news, legal aid, public records. They're your tools. Whether it's a garden bed or a front porch swing, you deserve to feel at home in your own home, because good neighborhoods aren't built on rules. They're built on respect.